In the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean during World War II, a silent predator stalked Allied shipping convoys. It moved beneath the waves, invisible to ships on the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When it attacked, torpedoes would slam into cargo ships and tankers, sending them to the bottom, along with their precious cargoes and crews. This predator was the German Type 7 U-boat, and it came closer to winning the war for Germany than any other weapon system. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Winston Churchill later called the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war, was fought primarily between Allied convoy escorts and German U-boats, with the Type 7 serving as Germany's primary weapon. The Type 7 U-boat was not the most advanced submarine of World War II. That distinction probably belongs to the German Type 21 or the American Gato-class boats. It wasn't the largest, the fastest, or the most comfortable, but it was reliable, relatively inexpensive to build, and available in large numbers. More Type 7 U-boats were built than any other submarine class in history. Over 700 boats entered service. These submarines sank approximately 2,770 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 14 million tons, along with numerous warships. The cost was high. Approximately 670 Type 7 boats were lost, taking about 26,000 German submariners to their deaths in what became one of the most dangerous military assignments of the entire war. The story of the Type 7 began in the early 1930s when Germany, forbidden by the Versailles Treaty from building submarines, secretly continued submarine development. German engineers worked abroad, particularly in the Netherlands, designing submarines that could theoretically be built for Germany if restrictions were lifted. When Hitler came to power in 1933 and began openly defying Versailles restrictions, these secret designs became the basis for Germany's new U-boat fleet. The Type 7 design emerged from this clandestine development program. The lead designer was Hans Techel, working at the Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw, IVS, in the Netherlands, a front company for German submarine development. Techel created a medium-sized submarine optimized for operations in the North Atlantic. It would be large enough to have adequate range and seaworthiness for ocean operations, but small enough to be built quickly and in large numbers. The first Type 7 submarines, designated Type 7A, were ordered in 1935. These initial boats displaced about 626 tons surfaced and 745 tons submerged. They were 211 feet long with a beam of 19 feet. A diesel-electric propulsion system gave them a surface speed of about 17 knots and a submerged speed of about 8 knots. Range was approximately 6,500 nautical miles at 12 knots on the surface. Armament consisted of 5 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 1 in the stern, with 11 torpedoes carried. A single 88mm deck gun and anti-aircraft machine guns provided surface armament. The crew consisted of 44 men, living in incredibly cramped conditions. Space was so limited that torpedoes were stored in the living areas, with crew members sleeping on bunks attached to the torpedo racks. The interior was a maze of pipes, valves, gauges, and machinery, all packed into a hull barely wide enough for a man to extend his arms fully. The air was constantly humid and smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the chemicals used to scrub carbon dioxide from the air. Living conditions in a Type 7 were notoriously harsh, even for submarine standards. But the Type 7A proved its concept, and improved versions quickly followed. The Type 7B, introduced in 1937, had slightly increased fuel capacity for longer range. The Type 7C, which entered service in 1940, became the most produced variant. It featured various improvements, including better diesel engines, improved diving depth capability, and enhanced anti-aircraft armament. The CC could dive about 750 feet operationally, though emergency deep dives could go deeper. Over 550 Type 7C boats were built, making it the single most numerous submarine class ever constructed. The Type 7C-41, an improved 7C with stronger pressure hull allowing deeper diving, entered service in 1943. The 7C-42, with even more improvements, was designed but never entered production before the war ended. These evolutionary improvements kept the basic Type 7 design competitive throughout the war, though by 1944 the design was clearly showing its age compared to newer Allied anti-submarine technology. The operational history of the Type 7 began before World War II officially started. U-boats, including Type 7s, were already deployed when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. On that same day, U-30, a Type 7A, commanded by Oberlieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, torpedoed and sank the British liner Athenia, killing 117 people, including 28 Americans. Lemp had mistaken Athenia for an armed merchant cruiser. The sinking, which resembled the Lusitania incident from World War I, created international outrage and embarrassment for Germany. Despite this inauspicious beginning, U-boats quickly proved effective against British shipping. In the early months of the war, operating under prize rules that required submarines to surface and warn merchant ships before attacking, U-boats achieved modest success. But as the war intensified and Germany abandoned prize rules in favor of unrestricted submarine warfare, U-boat effectiveness increased dramatically. The happy time, Glückliche Zeit in German, from June 1940 to February 1941, saw U-boats, primarily Type 7s, achieving remarkable success. France's surrender gave Germany access to French Atlantic ports, dramatically reducing the distance U-boats had to travel to reach operational areas. British anti-submarine defenses were still developing, and convoy escorts were insufficient in number and capability. U-boat captains like Gunther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke became aces, sinking enormous tonnages of Allied shipping. Captain Lieutenant Gunther Prien, commanding U-47, a Type 7B, achieved fame even before the happy time by penetrating the British naval base at Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sinking the battleship HMS Royal Oak. This daring raid, attacking a major warship in a supposedly secure anchorage, made Prien a national hero. He continued his success in the Atlantic, sinking numerous merchant ships before U-47 was lost with all hands in March 1941. Otto Kretschmer, commanding U-99, a Type 7B, became the highest-scoring U-boat ace of World War II, sinking 47 merchant ships and damaging others. His tactics emphasized careful stalking, night surface attacks from within the convoy itself, and precise torpedo fire. Kretschmer's motto was, "One torpedo, one ship." He disdained wasteful shooting and prided himself on efficiency. He was captured in March 1941 when U-99 was sunk by British escorts, and he spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. The happy time ended as British anti-submarine capabilities improved. Increased numbers of escort vessels, better tactics, improved radar and sonar, and the extension of air cover over more of the Atlantic made U-boat operations more dangerous. The loss of aces like Prien, Kretschmer, and Schepke in March 1941 marked the end of the period when individual U-boat commanders could operate with relative impunity. The introduction of Wolfpack tactics, Rudeltaktik in German, changed U-boat operations. Developed by Contra-Admiral Karl Donitz, who commanded U-boats and later became Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, Wolfpack tactics involved coordinating multiple U-boats against single convoys. When a U-boat located a convoy, it would shadow it while transmitting position reports. Other U-boats would converge on the convoy, and all would attack simultaneously or in coordinated sequence, overwhelming the escorts. Wolfpack attacks achieved considerable success from 1941 through early 1943. Convoys would suddenly face multiple U-boats attacking from different directions, making defense extremely difficult. The coordination required was complex. U-boats had to surface to use their radios for communication, exposing them to detection. But when Wolfpack attacks succeeded, the results could be devastating. Some convoys lost multiple ships in a single night to coordinated U-boat attacks.
The life of a Type 7 U-boat crew was extraordinarily difficult. Patrols typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks, though some extended longer. The crew lived in constant tension, knowing that depth charge attacks or air attack could come at any moment. Sleep was difficult. Crew members slept in shifts in cramped bunks, often fully clothed except for boots. Fresh food lasted only the first few days of a patrol. Thereafter, the crew subsisted on canned and preserved rations. Fresh water was scarce, used primarily for drinking and cooking. Bathing was impossible, and the crew didn't shave for weeks. The smell inside the boat became overwhelming, a mixture of diesel fumes, bilge water, unwashed bodies, food, and the chemical odor from the CO2 scrubbers that cleaned the air. Oberleutnant Werner Hartenstein, commander of U-156, described life aboard a Type 7. The conditions were medieval. 44 men living in a steel tube barely 6 meters wide, surrounded by machinery and weapons. Everything was damp. Condensation formed constantly on the cold steel hull, dripping onto bunks and equipment. Privacy was non-existent. Men learned to sleep through anything: the rumble of diesel engines, the orders being shouted, the sounds of depth charges exploding nearby. The psychological pressure was immense. We were hunters, but we were also hunted. Every time we dived to evade enemy aircraft or escorts, we wondered if this would be the time we wouldn't surface again. The dangers facing Type 7 crews were extreme. Depth charge attacks were terrifying experiences. When escort ships detected a submerged U-boat with sonar, called ASTIC by the British, they would attack with depth charges, barrels of explosives set to detonate at specific depths. A U-boat under depth charge attack would dive as deep as possible, shut down unnecessary machinery to reduce noise, and hope the charges exploded far enough away not to cause fatal damage. A near-miss depth charge would rock the boat violently, light bulbs would shatter, equipment would shake loose, and sometimes leaks would spring in the pressure hull or piping. Men would be thrown against machinery or bulkheads. The sound was indescribable. A massive hammer blow against the hull, followed by the roar of water and secondary explosions. A direct hit or very close near-miss would rupture the pressure hull, and the boat would sink so fast that most of the crew had no chance to escape. Machinist Werner Hirschman, who survived the sinking of U-352 off the U.S. coast in May 1942, described a depth charge attack. "We were at 150 meters depth when the first pattern exploded. The boat lurched sideways, and I was thrown against a valve assembly. Men were shouting, alarms were ringing, water was spraying from a fractured pipe. The commander ordered us deeper. We reached 200 meters, beyond our safe depth, and the hull was creaking under the pressure. More depth charges exploded. The sound was like being inside a bell that was being struck by a giant hammer. Cork insulation was raining down from the overhead. Electrical systems were shorting out, throwing sparks. We knew we might die at any second. When the attack finally stopped and we could surface hours later, I saw that several men had soiled themselves from fear. No one mocked them. We all understood." Air attack was another constant danger. Allied aircraft ranging from land-based patrol bombers to carrier-based planes hunted U-boats relentlessly. Early in the war, U-boats could often dive before aircraft could attack, but as aircraft were equipped with better radar and faster attack profiles, U-boats had less time to dive. By 1943, Allied aircraft were sinking U-boats faster than they could be replaced. When an aircraft was spotted, the U-boat commander faced a split-second decision: dive immediately or remain surfaced and fight with anti-aircraft guns. Diving offered protection, but left the boat vulnerable if the aircraft reached attack position before the boat was fully submerged. Fighting on the surface offered a chance to shoot down or drive off the aircraft, but exposed the boat to bombs, depth charges, or rockets. Many U-boats were lost because they chose wrong or simply didn't see the aircraft until it was too late. The introduction of Allied technologies progressively made U-boat operations more dangerous. Radar allowed surface ships and aircraft to detect U-boats on the surface at night or in poor visibility, conditions that had previously favored U-boats. HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, called HFDUF by the Allies, allowed convoy escorts to detect U-boat radio transmissions and determine their direction, enabling escorts to hunt U-boats that were shadowing convoys. Improved sonar made detecting submerged U-boats easier. Longer-range patrol aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap, the area beyond range of land-based aircraft where U-boats had previously operated with relative safety from air attack. The introduction of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that accompanied convoys, was particularly devastating to U-boats. These carriers provided air cover throughout the convoy's voyage, eliminating the mid-Atlantic gap. U-boats that surfaced to transit or recharge batteries faced immediate air attack. The combination of escort carriers, improved radar, better sonar, and well-trained escort groups turned the Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boats by mid-1943. May 1943 became known as Black May in the U-boat service. That month, 43 U-boats were lost, an unsustainable casualty rate. Dönitz temporarily withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that Allied countermeasures had made operations there too costly. While U-boats continued operating for the rest of the war, they never regained their earlier effectiveness. The Type 7, which had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic for Germany, was being defeated by Allied technological and tactical superiority. The Type 7 attempted to adapt to changing conditions. Anti-aircraft armament was increased dramatically. Early Type 7 U-boats had only machine guns for air defense. By 1943, U-boats were being fitted with quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft guns and even 37mm automatic cannons. Some boats bristled with anti-aircraft weapons, looking more like floating gun platforms than submarines. But this added weight affected diving time. The extra seconds needed to clear the deck guns and dive could mean the difference between safety and destruction. The Schnorkel device, introduced in 1944, allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged at periscope depth, drawing air through a tube that extended above the surface. This reduced the need to surface to recharge batteries, making U-boats less vulnerable to radar detection and air attack. But the Schnorkel was not a perfect solution. It reduced speed, could malfunction, and the boat still needed to come near the surface to use it. Despite these adaptations, the Type 7 was clearly approaching obsolescence by 1944. The new Type 21 U-boat, with its revolutionary design featuring high underwater speed, large battery capacity, and ability to remain submerged for extended periods, represented the future of submarine warfare. But the Type 21 entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. The Type 7 remained Germany's primary submarine throughout the war, continuing to serve even as its effectiveness declined. The human cost of Type 7 operations was staggering. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during World War II, about 30,000 died, a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of service in any nation during the war. The Type 7 boats, being the most numerous, accounted for the majority of these losses. When a U-boat was sunk, most or all of the crew usually died. The ocean was too cold for prolonged survival, rescue was unlikely, and the boat often sank so fast that crew had no chance to escape.
The psychological toll on surviving U-boat crews was immense. They watched friends and comrades go out on patrol and never return. They saw damaged U-boats return with dead and wounded aboard. They experienced depth charge attacks, air attacks, and the constant stress of operating in an environment that could kill them instantly. Yet they continued to sail, mission after mission, even as survival odds decreased. Kapitänleutnant Peter Kremer, who commanded U-333 and survived the war, wrote in his memoirs, "By 1943, we all knew the odds were against us. New boats would arrive at French bases, fresh crews eager and confident. We veterans would look at them and think, they'll be dead in 3 months. And usually they were. But we kept going out because that was our duty. Our comrades were still fighting, and surrender was not in our nature. Every time we left port, we knew we might not return. Every time we returned, we were grateful for another few weeks of life." The relationship between U-boat crews and their boats was intensely personal. The Type 7 was cramped, uncomfortable, and dangerous, but it was also home. Crews gave their boats nicknames, decorated living spaces with photos and memorabilia, and developed deep attachments to their vessels. When boats were lost, survivors mourned not just their dead comrades, but the boat itself. The technical capabilities of the Type 7 deserve detailed examination. The diesel-electric propulsion system was typical of World War II submarines. On the surface, diesel engines powered the boat and recharged the batteries. Submerged, electric motors powered by batteries drove the boat. This system was simple and reliable, but had significant limitations. Battery capacity limited submerged endurance. A Type 7 could remain submerged for perhaps 24 hours at slow speed before needing to surface to recharge. At high underwater speed, battery endurance was measured in less than an hour. The diving process was carefully choreographed. When the order to dive was given, vents on the ballast tanks opened, allowing water to flood in while air escaped. The boat's weight increased, and it began to sink. Hydroplanes, horizontal control surfaces, were adjusted to control the angle of dive. A well-trained crew could dive from surface to periscope depth in about 30 seconds and reach safe depth in under a minute. Emergency dives could be slightly faster, but risked the boat diving at too steep an angle, potentially causing loss of control. Surfacing was the reverse process. Compressed air was blown into the ballast tanks, forcing water out and decreasing the boat's weight until it rose to the surface. The process took longer than diving, perhaps 2 minutes to surface from deep depth. This made surfacing more dangerous as the boat was vulnerable during the process and couldn't abort if threats appeared. Torpedo attacks required careful calculation and precision. The Type 7's primary weapon was the G7A or G7E torpedo. The G7A was powered by a compressed air engine, left a visible wake, but had long range and high speed. The G7E was electric, left no wake, but had shorter range and was slower. Torpedoes carried a 280-kilogram warhead capable of breaking a merchant ship's back or seriously damaging a warship. Firing a torpedo successfully required calculating the target's course and speed, setting the torpedo to run at the correct depth, and timing the shot so the torpedo and target arrived at the same point simultaneously. Manual calculations using mechanical computers helped, but commanders still needed good judgment and experience. A poorly aimed torpedo would miss, wasting a precious weapon and alerting the target to the U-boat's presence. Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, described torpedo tactics. The ideal attack was from the target's beam, firing perpendicular to its course. This gave the largest target and required the least precision in calculating lead angle. But convoys were protected, so beam attacks were often impossible. We attacked from ahead or astern, fired from within the convoy at close range, or fired long-range shots when nothing else was possible. Each torpedo was precious. We carried only 11 or 12, and once they were gone, the patrol was effectively over. Every shot had to count. Missing was not just disappointing, it was wasteful of resources Germany couldn't afford to waste. The deck gun, an 88mm cannon on early Type 7s, was used for surface attacks on smaller, undefended vessels. Using the gun conserved torpedoes, which were expensive and limited in number. The tactic was to surface, use the gun to sink or damage the target, then dive if threats appeared. But as Allied anti-submarine efforts improved, deck gun attacks became increasingly dangerous, and by 1943 they were rarely attempted. Communication was a constant challenge for U-boats. Radio transmissions could be detected by Allied HFDF systems, revealing the U-boat's approximate location. But U-boats needed to communicate, to report convoy sightings, receive orders, and coordinate wolfpack attacks. The solution was to keep transmissions brief and to use Enigma coding machines to encrypt messages. The Allies' success in breaking Enigma codes gave them invaluable intelligence on U-boat positions and intentions, although the Germans never fully realized to what extent their codes had been compromised. The daily routine aboard a Type 7 was strictly organized. Watches were stood in rotation, with crew members spending hours at action stations or monitoring equipment. Meals were prepared in a tiny gallery and eaten at whatever space was available. There was no dedicated mess area. Sleep was grabbed in shifts. When submerged during daylight to avoid air attack, the boat operated in near darkness to conserve battery power. When surfaced at night to transit or recharge batteries, lookouts scanned the sky constantly for aircraft. Maintenance was constant and critical. Diesel engines needed regular service. Batteries required monitoring and maintenance. Torpedo tubes and torpedoes needed attention. The countless valves, pumps, and systems throughout the boat all needed maintenance. Engineering crew members worked almost continuously, and even off-duty crew might be called to help with major maintenance tasks. Medical facilities were minimal. The boat had a small medical kit and basic supplies, but serious injuries or illnesses could not be treated effectively. There was no qualified doctor aboard. The senior-most crew member with any medical training would do his best. Men who became seriously ill or injured on patrol often died, as the boat couldn't surface and rendezvous with other vessels without exposing itself to attack. Some boats had to abort patrols and return to base with seriously ill or injured crew members. The social dynamics in such confined conditions were complex. The crew had to function as a cohesive unit under extreme stress. Tensions inevitably arose, but they had to be managed. There was nowhere to go to escape conflict. Commanders who maintained good crew morale, who balanced discipline with care for their men's well-being, generally had more effective boats. Poor leaders created dysfunctional crews that performed badly in combat.
The relationship between officers and enlisted men was generally less rigid in U-boats than in other branches of military service. The shared hardship and danger created bonds that transcended rank. Commanders who proved themselves in combat earned genuine respect from their crews. Officers who were incompetent or cowardly were universally despised. The extreme conditions aboard a Type 7 revealed character in ways that normal military service never did. Religious observance varied. Some crew members were devout and prayed regularly. Others abandoned faith in the face of constant danger. Some boats had informal religious services. Others ignored religion entirely. But virtually all submariners, religious or not, developed superstitions. Lucky charms, specific pre-patrol rituals, and various superstitious beliefs were common. Anything that might improve odds of survival was embraced. The return to base after a successful patrol was euphoric. The boat would enter port flying victory pennants, one for each ship sunk. Brass bands would play, and officers would award decorations. The crew would get leave, time to bathe properly, sleep in real beds, eat hot meals, and try to forget the ocean for a few weeks. But the knowledge that they would soon return to sea, that each patrol might be their last, shadowed even these celebrations. The U-boat bases in French ports, Brest, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, and Bordeaux, became fortresses. Massive concrete pens were built to protect U-boats from Allied bombing. These pens had roofs up to 7 meters thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from the heaviest bombs available at the time. Inside, U-boats could be maintained, rearmed, and resupplied in relative safety. The bases became self-contained worlds with repair facilities, supply depots, barracks, and recreation facilities. Life at the bases alternated between boredom and terror. When U-boats were in port, crews had leisure time. They could visit local towns, drink in bars, and try to enjoy themselves. But Allied bombers regularly attacked the bases, and though the concrete pens protected the boats, the surrounding areas were devastated. By 1944, the French port cities housing U-boat bases were largely destroyed by repeated Allied bombing raids. The tactical evolution of U-boat warfare continued throughout the war. As Allied countermeasures improved, U-boat tactics adapted. U-boats began operating in different areas: the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, off the U.S. coast, in the Indian Ocean, seeking areas where Allied defenses were weaker. They attacked independently more often, as wolfpack coordination became more dangerous due to Allied HFDF detection of radio transmissions. They adopted more cautious tactics, attacking from greater ranges and diving immediately after firing rather than remaining to observe results. But none of these adaptations could overcome the fundamental shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. By 1943, the Allies were building merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Allied anti-submarine capabilities had improved to the point where U-boats faced greater danger than they inflicted. The Type 7, designed in the mid-1930s for the conditions of that era, was being defeated by technologies and tactics it had never been designed to face. The final missions of Type 7 U-boats were often desperate. With Allied forces dominating the Atlantic, U-boats struggled to reach operational areas. Some were sunk on their first patrol, destroyed by aircraft or surface ships before they even located a convoy. Others made multiple patrols but returned without sinking anything, having spent weeks at sea in terrible conditions without achieving their mission. A few boats, commanded by skilled, experienced commanders and manned by veteran crews, continued achieving successes even in 1944 and early 1945, but they were exceptions. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the remaining Type 7 U-boats were ordered to surface, display black flags, and proceed to designated ports for surrender. Some commanders obeyed. Others, unwilling to surrender, scuttled their boats. A few attempted to reach neutral ports, preferring internment to surrender. Most of the surviving Type 7 boats were eventually destroyed, either scuttled by the Allies or used as targets for weapons testing. The statistical record of Type 7 operations tells a story of initial success followed by eventual defeat. In 1940, U-boats, primarily Type 7s, sank over 2.5 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1911, tonnage sunk increased to over 3.6 million tons. In 1912, it peaked at over 6.2 million tons, the most successful year of the U-boat campaign. But in 1933, though U-boats still sank over 3 million tons, U-boat losses became unsustainable. In 1944, tonnage sunk dropped to about 1 million tons, and U-boat losses continued to mount. In the first 4 months of 1945, U-boats achieved almost nothing while continuing to suffer losses. Of the approximately 700 Type 7 U-boats that entered service, about 670 were lost during the war. The rest survived to surrender or were scuttled by their crews. The loss rate, over 95%, was staggering. For the men who served aboard these boats, the odds of survival were worse than almost any other military assignment in history. The legacy of the Type 7 extends beyond its wartime service. The boat demonstrated the potential of submarine warfare to strangle an island nation dependent on imports. It proved that relatively small, inexpensive weapons could threaten much larger, more expensive surface ships. It showed the importance of technological development. As Allied countermeasures improved, U-boat threat decreased, demonstrating that technology advantage is temporary and must be continuously developed. Post-war submarine development was influenced by lessons from the Type 7 campaign. The importance of underwater speed and endurance led to development of nuclear propulsion. The vulnerability of submarines to air attack led to improved sensors and weapons. The effectiveness of coordinated attacks led to development of submarine tactics that remain classified to this day. Modern submarine warfare owes much to the experiences of the Type 7 and its opponents in the Battle of the Atlantic. From a human perspective, the Type 7 story is one of extraordinary courage, terrible suffering, and ultimate sacrifice. The men who sailed in these boats knew the dangers they faced. They watched comrades die, experienced attacks that nearly killed them, and continued sailing into danger because duty demanded it. Whether one views them as defenders of Germany or as combatants in an unjust war, their personal courage and the hardships they endured cannot be denied. The Type 7 U-boat nearly changed the course of World War II. Had the Battle of the Atlantic been lost, Britain would have been starved of supplies, making the invasion of Europe impossible and potentially forcing British surrender. The fact that the Allies ultimately won the Battle of the Atlantic should not obscure how close the outcome was, particularly in 1942 and early 1933, when U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced and when Allied victory was far from certain. From the design tables in the Netherlands in the early 1930s to the concrete pens of French ports to the cold waters of the Atlantic where so many boats and crews found their final rest, the Type 7 U-boat left an indelible mark on history. It was a weapon that nearly won the war for Germany, a steel tomb for thousands of German sailors, and a terror to Allied seamen. It demonstrated the potential of submarine warfare and the importance of technological superiority. More than 70 decades after the last Type 7 surrendered or was scuttled, its influence on naval warfare and its place in the history of World War II endure. The wolf beneath the waves has long since fallen silent, but its legacy remains in every submarine that patrols the oceans today and in the memory of the brave men, Allied and German, who fought the Battle of the Atlantic.